Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're diving into a life story that literally plays out like a Hollywood movie. We're talking about a perfect three-act cinematic structure here. Act 1, the brilliant meteoric rise. Act 2, the devastating exile. And Act 3, the triumphant, absolutely world-changing return. We are exploring the life, the mind, and the massive legacy of Steve Jobs.
Okay, let's dive right into this, because this right here is the central paradox of Steve Jobs' life. Really think about this for a second. How does a guy who wandered around his college campus barefoot, returning empty glass Coke bottles just to buy food, end up creating the most valuable company on Earth? It's crazy, right? To understand the empire he built, we actually have to look away from the circuit boards for a minute and look straight at the counterculture of the 1970s.
You see, his foundational philosophy was totally clear right from the start. He was super inspired by Edwin Land of Polaroid, and Jobs realized early on that pure engineering, well, it just wasn't enough. It had to have a soul. Even back in high school, his interests were totally split. On one hand, he's devouring Shakespeare and Plato, and on the other, he's building electronics in the garage with his buddy Steve Wozniak. He was kind of too intellectual to just be a pure hippie, but way too artistic to be a pure nerd. So he deliberately placed himself right at the intersection of the humanities and the sciences.
And man, that intersection led him to some deeply bohemian early years. He actually dropped out of Reed College pretty quickly because he felt like he was just wasting his parents' life savings. But he didn't leave. He stayed on campus, just dropping in on the classes that interested him, most notably a calligraphy course taught by a Trappist monk. After that, he traveled all the way through India, seeking spiritual enlightenment, practiced Zen Buddhism. He even experimented with LSD, which he later called one of the absolute most important things he'd ever done. Now you might be wondering, what does a calligraphy class have to do with computers? Well, 10 years later, that single class would be the exact reason the very first Macintosh had beautiful, proportionally spaced typefaces. It's like a giant puzzle. His whole life was a masterclass in connecting these seemingly totally unrelated dots.
Those dots connected brilliantly when he officially partnered up with Steve Wozniak. Now, Wozniak was the brilliant engineer who actually built the circuit boards, but it was Jobs who had the vision to sell them to the masses. They founded Apple Computer in Jobs' parents' garage back in 1976, and the name Apple, he chose it simply because he'd recently gotten back from working at an apple orchard on a commune in Oregon. Simple as that. By 1977, they launched the Apple II, and Jobs was adamant. It couldn't just be some bare circuit board for tech hobbyists. No way. He oversaw the development of this friendly, consumer-appealing plastic case. That one decision turned the Apple II into one of the very first highly successful, mass-produced microcomputers in the world.
And the financial result of that consumer appeal? It's a truly staggering number. By the time Steve Jobs was just 25 years old, 25, his estimated net worth had skyrocketed to $250 million. Just put that into perspective for a second. Think about that stark contrast. Literally just a few years prior, he was relying on free weekly meals at the local Hare Christian temple just to eat. Now, he was one of the youngest people to ever make the Forbes list of the nation's richest people, and he did it without inherited wealth. But as you'll see, that immense corporate ambition came with a really, really sharp edge.
Now, what's really interesting about this concept of his reality distortion field is how it worked as a massive double-edged sword. On one hand, it was a total superpower. It allowed him to drive engineering teams to achieve the impossible, completely bending their perception of what could actually be done in reality. But on the other hand, it severely strained his personal relationships. For instance, when his early girlfriend Chris Ann Brennan became pregnant, Jobs initially used this same intense distortion to publicly and legally deny paternity of his daughter Lisa. He even went so far as to suggest in a Time magazine interview that 28% of the male population could be the father, despite a DNA test proving otherwise. It's a pretty stark reminder of the deeply flawed human being behind all this genius.
Despite all that, his relentless drive absolutely pushed the whole industry forward. Cut to 1984, and Apple launches the Macintosh. Jobs had seen a graphical user interface during a tour of a Xerox facility. And right then, he just knew. Typing lines of green code into a blank command prompt, that was the past. The Macintosh was the very first mass-produced computer to feature a graphical interface and a mouse, a real game changer. And true to his flair for the dramatic, he introduced the whole shebang with a massive $1.5 million Super Bowl commercial directed by Ridley Scott. It famously framed Apple as this colorful, heroic rebellion against the gray, dystopian conformity of IBM.
But internally, things were getting messy, and this brilliantly illustrates the clash of visions that was basically a ticking time bomb. Jobs had personally recruited John Scully from Pepsi. You've probably heard the famous pitch. Do you want to spend the rest of your life selling sugared water? Or do you want a chance to change the world?
But once Scully actually arrived, their visions completely collided. Scully wanted an open, expandable architecture, kind of like the Apple II. But Jobs, he demanded the closed, tightly controlled ecosystem of the Mac. Well, the Macintosh was struggling with slow sales at the time, and the board ultimately sided with Scully. So in 1985, completely stripped of his power, Steve Jobs submitted his resignation. He was effectively exiled from the exact company he had built from scratch.
Which brings us right into Act 2, the wilderness years. But for Jobs, exile wasn't a retreat. Actually, scratch that, it was more like an incubation period. He founded a new company called Next, aiming to build super advanced computers for higher education. And in 1986, he bought the computer graphics division of Lucasfilm for $10 million. He spun it off into an independent company, you might have heard of it, called Pixar. He then executive produced Toy Story, the first ever entirely computer-animated feature film, which was a massive critical and commercial smash hit. So, his so-called failures and exile outside of Apple, they were actually laying the massive groundwork for his biggest future triumphs. Just look at the incredible irony of Next. The Next workstation retailed for nearly $10,000. It was largely dismissed as a total commercial failure because it was way too expensive for the schools it was targeting. Yet, a computer scientist over in Switzerland named Tim Berners-Lee used a Next computer to literally invent the World Wide Web. No way, right? And even more crucially, Next's operating system, called NextStep, was so unbelievably advanced that Apple eventually bought the entire company just to get their hands on it. That exact software became the very foundation for Mac OS X and eventually the software running on the iPhone.
Which perfectly sets the stage for Act 3. By 1997, Apple was in big trouble, practically on the absolute verge of bankruptcy. To survive, they bought Next, which brought Jobs right back into the fold. He stepped in as the interim CEO, or as he playfully joked, the iCEO, and went on an absolute tear. He ruthlessly terminated dozens of failing, scattered projects to focus the entire company on just a few key products. And to rally the remaining, honestly terrified staff, he launched the iconic Think Different advertising campaign. It was a brilliant move to remind Apple of its own identity and soul.
What followed was, for sure, perhaps the greatest corporate turnaround in the history of business. It was just a rapid-fire cultural revolution. In 1998, he launched the iMac, that candy-colored translucent computer that boldly ditched the floppy drive for USB ports. Then in 2001, he put 1,000 songs in your pocket with the iPod. In 2007, he completely revolutionized the mobile phone industry with the multi-touch iPhone. And then in 2010, he created an entirely new category of device with the iPad. Just take a second, look at the smartphone in your hand right now. The way you interact with information, the way you consume your media, the way we all communicate daily, it is all directly downstream from this exact timeline of consecutive cultural resets.
So, how did he do it? Well, Jobs loved this famous quote from Wayne Gretzky, "I skate to where the puck is going to be, not where it has been." While other companies relied on endless focus groups to see what customers wanted right now, Jobs relied entirely on his own intuition to see what they would want tomorrow. And doing that, it required an unapologetic, almost maddening perfectionism. I mean, he obsessed over the aesthetics of the circuit boards hidden inside the machines, things the user would literally never even see. And he curated his own image with that exact same ruthless simplicity. He adopted a daily uniform, a black Issey Miyake turtleneck, Levi's 501 jeans, and New Balance sneakers. The idea was simple: remove all the daily friction and focus entirely on the design.
Tragically, though, his story was cut short. In 2003, Jobs was diagnosed with a rare form of pancreatic cancer. For 9 months, he resisted his doctor's strong recommendations for surgery. Instead, he opted to try alternative medicines, things like vegan diets, acupuncture, and herbal remedies. He did later express regret for this delay. After finally undergoing surgery and eventually a liver transplant, his health unfortunately continued to decline. In August of 2011, recognizing he could just no longer meet his duties, he officially resigned as Apple's CEO, handing the reins over to Tim Cook. Just 6 weeks later, Steve Jobs passed away. He was only 56 years old.
So as we wrap up this explainer, I want to leave you with this thought-provoking question. We've traced this wildly dramatic journey from a barefoot college dropout seeking enlightenment in India to an ousted founder to the visionary leader who permanently shaped how humanity communicates. But it all links back to his profound belief in standing at the intersection of the humanities and the sciences. What if he hadn't audited that single calligraphy course? What if he hadn't insisted that technology absolutely must be beautiful to be useful? It's a huge testament to the fact that no knowledge is ever truly wasted, and that true world-changing innovation happens when you have the courage to trust your own intuition.
Thanks for joining me for this explainer, and remember, keep connecting those dots.